It began with a scrape of metal under frozen ground. A team of civil engineers widening a mountain road in Bavaria hit a sealed door. Half buried, unlit, unmarked. When the slab finally cracked open, cold air pushed out like a held breath from another century. Inside were racks of crates stamped with Reich codenames and a ledger of names no state had ever admitted existed. In that moment, the line between history and ongoing concealment collapsed in plain daylight. Chapter 1. Before the war broke open. In the late 1930s, Europe did not feel like a battlefield yet. It felt like a continent holding its breath. Radio still played waltzes in Vienna cafes. Tailors in Warsaw still took measurements for spring coats. Children in Rotterdam still kicked balls in alleys that would soon be reduced to brick powder. The quiet was deceptive, but to anyone who read newspapers without blinking, the tension was already structural. Steel quotas, fuel stockpiles, shipyards lit past midnight, railheads re-timetabled for unspecified heavy freight. The people who lived ordinary lives could feel something under the floorboards. It was not a theory, it was mood. In Berlin, posters hardened in tone with each new month. The rhetoric simplified. Enemies were named, purified, and repeated until repetition felt like truth. The cabinets of Europe watched, counted, and hesitated. The League of Nations talked like a hole with no walls. It could hear itself but stop nothing. Across the Atlantic, Americans were tired of losses that were not theirs and wanted no second trench of grief. Isolation felt like a moat, wide, deep, and rational, until the world proved otherwise. Inside governments, the vocabulary changed first. Words like mobilization, pre-delegated authority, and industrial surge appeared in minutes that were still stamped secret. States acted weeks or months before populations perceived it. France doubled work shifts at fortification lines. Britain rearmed the air while still printing polite headlines about talks. The Soviet Union purged its own officer corps with a violence colder than any battlefield, gambling that ideology could replace experience at scale. The atmosphere of cities reflected the drift. In Prague, whispers in tramcars ended when uniforms boarded. In Madrid, exhausted veterans limped from a civil war that had served as a rehearsal for the next war everyone knew was coming. In Tokyo, cabinets mapped a resource perimeter across seas they did not own yet. In Rome, the architecture of triumph returned before triumph existed. What made the decade unstable was not only what leaders wanted, but what wide publics permitted through fatigue, humiliation, or hope. Versailles did not end 1918. It stored resentment in the bank. Inflation, humiliation, and unemployment made simple stories seductive. People wanted velocity out of crisis. Any velocity. Flags and certainties were faster than reforms. And still the surface felt normal. There were still weddings. There were still cinemas. There were still Saturday markets with sacks of flour and gossip about neighbors. But the strategic layer had already detached from daily life. The state was winding a spring beneath the table while the citizen drank coffee above it. In Poland, diplomats sent cables in language almost parental. The window is closing. In London, some MPs warned that air war would make cities into crematoria with postcodes. They were heckled until time declared them accurate. In Moscow, Stalin signed pacts that baffled the moral imagination, but made ruthless sense inside his logic of breathing space. In Washington, the White House fought its own electorate more than any foreign capital. The public wanted distance. The world was shrinking distance to zero. The last summer before rupture carried an eerie sweetness. Photos from seaside towns show umbrellas, children, newspapers folded at the weather page. People smiled at cameras, unaware that within one calendar, they would sleep under sirens or in cellars. The world still had color film, but history was about to develop in black. Then there was the private interior climate, the thing no archive preserves. The look exchanged by two adults at dinner when the radio cut to a bulletin. The hesitation before signing a mortgage when rumors said borders might move. The way handwriting changes when a man knows conscription is not hypothetical. You can see it in diaries. Sentences contract. Verbs sharpen. If becomes when. States did not stumble into 1939 like sleepwalkers. They arrived with files, flows, rehearsals, and models. Intelligence services had already mapped the future in draft. Target lists, choke points, sabotage triggers, currency plays, fifth column protocols, exile governments on ice. The war existed in the subjunctive mood on paper before it, existed in the indicative mood in blood, and Beneath all of that lived the civilian body of Europe, millions of throats and lungs that would soon be pulled through a decade of cold mathematics. They did not consent, but they lived within states that could decide for them. It is the oldest asymmetry in political life. Leaders wager, populations pay. By the final pre-war autumn, noise replaced doubt, border incidents, cables without adjectives, gold transfers, quiet evacuations of art, a sense that the hinge had turned and could not swing back. Yet shops still closed at 8, postmen still rang bells. The ordinariness of the last calm day is the most violent fact in hindsight. The clock had already declared itself. The room just had not heard it yet. Chapter 1. Before the lines froze. A world unprepared. Before the machinery of suppression began. Before the empires traded scientists as contraband. Europe still looked negotiable. In the early 1930s, the world was not at war. It was merely rearranging itself under pressure. Credit vanished, borders hardened, and populations that once crossed frontiers for work or love now moved like contraband through stamped paper. In Berlin, political violence became furniture, always present, seldom shocking. In Washington, the New Deal wrestled its own emergencies. In London, the empire thinned at the edges. Across these capitals, the war to come lived first as tone, posture, hesitation, a tightening in the jaw before a blow that had not yet landed. Inside universities and industrial combines, the next conflict incubated in budgets and blueprints long before it detonated on ground. Military staffs in Paris and Warsaw wrote plans that assumed the next war would look like the last. Lines, trenches, exhaustion. They misread the tempo. In Moscow, purges tore out entire chains of command. In Tokyo, planners wrote as if the oceans could be outrun by audacity. In Rome, spectacle substituted for strength. In Berlin, the regime refit the nation for a speed of violence that the rest of the planet still mentally measured in calendar time instead of stopwatch time. The fuse was not yet lit, but the powder was drying and stacked. Families tried to live as if nothing had shifted. Radios stayed tuned to dance music until speeches cut across the band. People married, planted, saved, and bought winter coats, insisting life was continuous when it was already breaking by the inch. German engineers returned from rearmament plants smelling of hot steel and solvent. They brought their pay home without speaking about what the contract lines implied. French reservists drilled on quiet weekends and told themselves deterrence would work because it must was. Americans read about fascism and famine as if they were weather on another continent. Britain retreated into understatement, calling crises difficulties, while writing secret contingency files in locked rooms beneath Whitehall. The decisive moves were not yet kinetic. They were structural. Laboratories were consolidated behind loyalty oaths. Patents were seized under national prerogatives. Airfields lengthened. Staff colleges rewrote assumptions about range, lift, shock, and morale. Border states lived with the metallic anxiety of being buffers, large enough to be fought across, too small to refuse. Czechoslovakia watched the Sudetenland erode by rhetoric before troops ever marched. Austria discovered that a referendum could be replaced by a column of trucks with loudspeakers. Every state pretended it still had a choice, until the calendar withdrew the privilege. Even before the first annexations, the future of captured brains and hardware was already an unspoken category of planning. In Berlin and Washington alike, sections of intelligence machinery kept clippings on the same scientists, chemists, aerodynamicists, cryptographers, physicians, not for their published work, but for what they could be made to do under pressure. When the war would finally begin, the victors would not only collect ground and flags, they would collect talent. The pre-war world stood quietly on that ledger, without yet admitting that human minds would become a currency more valuable than land. Rearmament was public in its effect, but private in its interior logic. To ordinary citizens, smokestacks, barracks, and parade grounds simply looked like work. To the men drafting the memoranda behind them, each poured footing and each conscripted year was a pre-decision toward irreversibility. Diplomacy continued only because no capital wanted to own the blame for ending it first. States spoke the language of peace into microphones while writing the grammar of shock into budgets. The silence between these two registers, the said and the meant, is where the pre-war world really lived. Meanwhile, the United States watched as a buffered observer, huge, insulated by water and industry, convinced it could time its entry or avoid one entirely. Congress passed neutrality with the posture of a firebreak. Wall Street continued to lend with the posture of denial. Yet in war colleges and in quiet liaison rooms with British and French staff, models of industrial surge and maritime escort were rehearsed as if inevitability were already signed. The American home front slept on the belief that oceans are armor. The American state did not. Europeans felt the temperature rise before the thermometer moved. Trains filled with uniform cloth, radios carried more speech and fewer songs. Statues acquired wreaths. Newspapers learned which verbs to avoid. The air tightened above the continent like low-pressure weather that never clears. Everyone could feel it. No one could disperse it. The pre-war world had the sensation of a room where oxygen is being silently pulled out. Nothing is happening, yet breath shortens. By the late 1930s, momentum replaced preference. The war that would later bury evidence and generate secrets worth suppressing was now guaranteed by geometry, force concentrated against fragile perimeters, alliances tied to trigger clauses, and regimes that could not afford to stop without falling. Once annexation succeeded without consequence, the next demand became cheaper. Once one border yielded, others lost meaning. The system had no stable resting point left. It would run until something broke or someone surrendered. People alive in those years did not say, "We are in the prologue of annihilation." They bought bread, sent children to school, listened to the wireless, and called what they were living normal. Only later did it become obvious that the fuse of a continental implosion had already been run out beneath their feet. When guns finally opened, it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like the delayed arrival of a verdict that had been written years earlier. That is the world that must be understood before we follow the chain toward capture, transfer and burial of knowledge. For the later secrecy to make sense, the sealed vaults, the air-gapped memoirs, the disappearances into post-war contracts, one must see how total the pre-decision was. Europe did not slide into catastrophe by accident. It constructed a corridor with no exits, and once the first shells flew, every state began to plan not only to win the war, but to harvest what the war would make deniable. The ground was not only being prepared for battle, it was being prepared for future amnesia. Chapter 3. Stalingrad, the turning of the tide. Winter came early to the Volga in 1942. The river froze solid, the wind cutting through uniforms like knives. Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial city, had become a graveyard of steel and brick. It wasn't just another battle. It was a test of will, of endurance, of what human beings could bear before breaking. Both Hitler and Stalin saw it not as a military target, but as a symbol. One bore the leader's name, the other wanted to erase it from the map. When the German Sixth Army crossed the Volga's western banks in the summer, they believed the city would fall within weeks. They had been unstoppable until now, sweeping across the steppe, taking town after town. The Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad day and night, reducing entire districts to rubble. Smoke hung low over the river. Civilians fled where they could, but most were trapped. The streets became trenches. Every building, every factory was a fortress. The fighting was personal, room to room, floor to floor. They called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. From diaries and letters, we know what those days felt like. The snow is black with ash, one Soviet nurse wrote. The wounded lie in stairwells because there are no walls left to shelter them. For the Germans, it was the same hell from the other side. We freeze, we starve, a corporal scrawled in a notebook. We are told victory is near, but the Volga does not move. Both armies suffered, trapped by their leader's pride and the merciless Russian winter. Soviet reinforcements crossed the frozen river under shell fire, their boots crunching on ice that cracked beneath them. Supplies were carried by sled, sometimes by hand. The city became a labyrinth of snipers and shadows. At night, the air was alive with whispers. Men crawling between ruins, scavenging food, searching for warmth. There was no day or night anymore, only survival. A factory worker turned soldier later said, "You didn't think about tomorrow. You just kept breathing because to stop was to die." As autumn deepened, the tide began to shift. Soviet General Zhukov had been planning a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. On November 19, 1942, under a pale, frozen dawn, it began. Soviet artillery opened fire across hundreds of miles of front. The thunder was so constant that birds took flight from forests miles away. Within days, two massive Red Army pincers encircled the German Sixth Army. What had been the conqueror became the trapped. Supply lines were cut, the winter closed in. In Berlin, Hitler refused to allow retreat. Stalingrad will be held, he ordered, not one step back. The order sealed the fate of over 300,000 men. Luftwaffe pilots tried to resupply them by air, but the weather and Soviet flak made it nearly impossible. Planes were shot down one after another, their cargo falling in flames. Soldiers below starved, resorting to eating frozen horse meat, sometimes worse. Frostbite claimed fingers, feet, faces. "We no longer fear death," wrote one sergeant in a letter never sent. It would be a relief. Inside the city, the fighting was beyond human comprehension. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Men fought over rooms without walls, over staircases that led to nothing. The Pavlov House, a single apartment building held by Soviet defenders, became legend. For 59 days, a handful of soldiers held off waves of German assaults. When asked later how they survived, one replied simply, "We stopped being afraid." By January 1943, the encircled German army was collapsing. Their commander, Friedrich Paulus, requested permission to surrender. Hitler's reply was cold: "You will stand or die." On February 2nd, after weeks of starvation and ceaseless bombardment, Paulus finally gave the order his men had been waiting for: to lay down their arms. The battle was over. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever return. When the news reached Berlin, silence filled the air. For the first time, the German people understood the war could be lost. Goebbels tried to twist the defeat into propaganda, calling for total war, but the illusion of invincibility was broken. Across Europe, occupied nations felt a flicker of hope. Stalingrad had turned the tide. For the Soviets, victory came at a staggering cost. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians were dead. The city was gone, a landscape of shattered concrete and frozen corpses. Yet amid the ruins, the survivors raised the red flag over the city's central square. A photographer captured it in grainy black and white. A moment of triumph carved from unimaginable suffering. The world watched in awe and horror. Western newspapers called it the grave of the Wehrmacht. Military strategists began to rewrite their maps. Churchill sent a message to Stalin: "Your victory is magnificent." But for the men and women who endured Stalingrad, there was nothing magnificent about it. It was survival. Bare, brutal human survival. As spring thawed the Volga once again, bodies emerged from the snow. Children who had hidden through the siege came out blinking into the pale sun, searching for their parents. Soldiers, now veterans at 20, walked among the ruins in silence. One survivor recalled years later, "You didn't cheer when it was over. You just breathed because the guns had finally stopped." Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a turning point in the moral landscape of the war. The moment when the myth of Nazi dominance cracked and the world began to believe victory might be possible. But the cost was almost beyond comprehension. The city that bore Stalin's name had endured hell, and in doing so had changed the course of history. From that frozen ruin, the war entered a new phase. The Red Army would push westward, step by bloody step. The Allies, preparing their assault from the opposite end of the continent, saw the path to victory open. But in the ashes of Stalingrad, no one spoke of triumph, only of loss and of what it had taken to survive another day. Chapter 5: The Echoes That Remain. Time has a way of softening sound, but some echoes never fade. Even now, more than 80 years later, the Second World War lingers. In the faces of those who remember, in the cities rebuilt upon ruins, in the silences between generations. The guns stopped long ago, yet the questions they raised still hang in the air. How did it happen? Why did so many follow? And what does it mean to remember? In the aftermath, the world tried to rebuild not just buildings, but belief. Belief in decency, in law, in something better than what had been lost. Nations signed charters, built institutions, meant to prevent the unthinkable from happening again. The United Nations was born. New borders were drawn. Old empires fell, but peace was fragile, and memory became a weapon in its own right. The victors wrote history, while survivors tried to reclaim their voices from silence. Museums were built, monuments raised. Yet behind the marble and bronze lay something simpler: the desperate human need to make sense of the senseless. For the men and women who fought, the war never truly ended. Veterans came home to quiet streets that no longer felt like home. Some could not speak of what they had seen. Others spoke of nothing else. In the factories, in the fields, in the classrooms of post-war Europe and America, they tried to rebuild lives piece by piece. A British pilot once said, "We won the war and lost the years we could have lived." Across the ocean, a German soldier in his later years wrote in his diary, "I was 18 when it began. I am 80 now, and I still dream of snow and fire." In every country, stories of ordinary courage slowly surfaced. A French farmer who hid Jewish families in his barn, a Russian nurse who carried the wounded through shell fire, a Japanese schoolteacher who survived Hiroshima and dedicated her life to peace. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, but their choices shaped the quiet aftermath. They are reminders that history is not just made by generals and politicians. It is carried by ordinary people who choose compassion over hatred when it matters most. The war, also, transformed the way humanity saw itself. The discovery of the Holocaust forced the world to confront the depths of its own cruelty. The Nuremberg trials defined crimes so heinous they required new language. Genocide, crimes against humanity. From those horrors came movements for human rights, for international justice, for remembrance. Yet even as the laws were written, new conflicts began. Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, proving that the lessons of the past are never guaranteed to last. The echo, it seems, must be heard again and again to be understood. In the decades that followed, the artifacts of war became relics of warning. Bomb shelters turned into museums, bunkers filled with rusting metal and the smell of earth. Each object told a fragment of a larger truth. The helmet dented by shrapnel, the photograph found in a trench coat pocket, the child's toy burned and fused into glass. These were not symbols of victory, but of endurance, proof that life somehow persisted. Archaeologists still find them today, buried beneath highways and farmland. Each discovery pulls the past a little closer, reminding us that history is not behind us. It lives under our feet. As the survivors grow fewer, their memories become more precious. Their testimonies, recorded on tape, written in trembling hands, are the world's last connection to what it felt like to stand in the smoke of that century-defining fire. When they speak, the air changes, the room quiets. You can feel the weight of years pressing through every word. "We were just children," one woman said, recalling the day her village was bombed. "And somehow we kept living, that is all." Today, the world they fought for feels both distant and fragile. New walls rise where old ones fell. Nations turn inward. Truth is questioned. And yet, amid the noise of modern life, there are still those who stop, listen, and remember. They walk the beaches of Normandy, the forests of Poland, the ruins of Berlin. Not as tourists, but as witnesses. They read the names carved in stone and whisper them aloud, because saying them keeps them alive. What remains, after all the history books and monuments, are the choices we make when faced with fear and power. The war was a collision of ideologies, but its legacy belongs to humanity as a whole. The promise to recognize danger before it becomes destiny. Never again, people said when it ended. But those words are not a spell. They are a responsibility, renewed with every generation that dares to remember. As the last light of the 20th century fades into memory, we look back not for glory, but for understanding. The soldiers who fought, the civilians who endured, the millions who never returned, they remind us that history is not distant. It breathes through us. It warns. It asks us to see. And somewhere, beneath the fields of Europe, beneath the quiet streets rebuilt from ashes, their echoes still rise. Not as ghosts, but as reminders that the cost of forgetting is always too high, and that the silence after war is not peace, but the space where humanity decides what comes next. Chapter 4: Shadows of Victory. When the guns finally fell silent over Stalingrad, the sound of war still echoed across continents. In 1943, the Allies began to strike back in earnest. The deserts of North Africa burned under the midday sun as British and American troops pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps into retreat. In the air above Europe, American bombers darkened the skies, hundreds of B-17s flying in tight formation, engines roaring like thunder, bound for the heart of Germany. Below them, anti-aircraft fire traced white arcs through the clouds. The war was shifting, but victory was not yet within reach, not even close. In every occupied city, the resistance began to stir. Messages scratched into walls, whispered in cellars, passed through coded radio broadcasts. In Warsaw, Paris, Amsterdam, men and women risked everything to fight from the shadows. They forged documents, sabotaged trains, hid the hunted in cramped basements. Every act of defiance carried the weight of death. Yet still they acted. "We live in darkness," one French partisan wrote, "but at least it is our own." Their courage did not turn the tide alone, but it reminded the world what humanity could still be, even as everything seemed to crumble. By 1944, Allied soldiers stood poised for the greatest gamble of the war. In the early hours of June 6th, under heavy rain and flickering lightning, the invasion of Normandy began. Operation Overlord, D-Day. The beaches were codenamed like secrets. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. More than 150,000 men crossed the English Channel, seasick, silent, some clutching letters they would never send. When the landing craft ramps dropped, chaos erupted. Machine gun fire cut through the surf. The sea turned red. Yet somehow, through sheer will and terrible sacrifice, they broke through. By nightfall, the Allies held a foothold in France. Europe's liberation had begun. In the east, the Red Army surged forward, reclaiming city after city, pushing the Germans back toward their own borders. Each advance revealed horrors that few could comprehend. The first concentration camps were discovered, places like Majdanek and Treblinka. Empty now, but heavy with the smell of death. The soldiers who entered them didn't cheer. They stood in stunned silence, unable to understand how such evil could be humanly made. "We thought we'd seen everything," one lieutenant wrote. "But this is something from hell itself." As the Allies advanced, the skies above Germany burned. City after city, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, was reduced to rubble. The firebombing campaigns left scars that would never fade. Civilians dug through ruins, searching for family members, for a photograph, a ring, anything that remained of life before. The victors would later debate the morality of it. But in those days, there was only one thought: end the war, whatever it took. The cruelty of the years before had hardened hearts on every side. In Italy, Mussolini's empire crumbled. In the Pacific, island battles raged in jungles thick with heat and disease. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, every inch of ground was bought with blood. Soldiers grew old in months. They wrote home less often, their letters shorter, their handwriting shakier. "I don't think I'll see another Christmas," one Marine confessed. Many didn't. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, Germany was collapsing from within. Cities starved. The front was everywhere and nowhere. Hitler, hidden in his Berlin bunker, raged at maps that no longer matched reality. His generals begged him to surrender. He refused. The end came not with a single battle, but with exhaustion. The slow unraveling of a world gone mad. When Soviet troops finally reached the Reichstag, they fought through streets lined with corpses and broken dreams. The red flag rose above the ruins of Berlin. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. But the war's shadow didn't lift that day. It merely changed shape. In the months that followed, Europe faced the grim task of reckoning with what had been done. The camps were liberated. Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. Cameras rolled, documenting what no one had believed possible. Skeletal survivors blinked at the daylight, too weak to stand. The soldiers who freed them wept openly. The footage was shown in newsreels across the world, a mirror held up to humanity's darkest hour. "Now the world will know," one British cameraman whispered, his voice trembling behind the lens. Millions were displaced. Cities lay in ruins, entire generations erased. Children wandered roads with tags around their necks. Unaccompanied, families searched lists of the missing, hoping for names that never appeared. In Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, a new kind of weapon had ended the war in the Pacific, a weapon that changed everything. The mushroom cloud became the new symbol of power and fear. The atomic age had begun, and with it, a silence deeper than any before. As 1946 arrived, the victors gathered in Nuremberg to hold the guilty to account. The courtroom smelled of old wood and tobacco. The defendants sat in glass booths, their faces pale under harsh lights. The evidence was overwhelming. Films of mass graves, documents signed in cold ink, testimonies of survivors. "We were only following orders," they said. But the world had learned those words too well. Justice came, imperfect and incomplete, but it came nonetheless. For many, it was the first step toward healing. For others, it was not nearly enough. The rebuilding of Europe was slow, painful, and uncertain. Rubble became foundation. Cities rose again, but the people who built them carried memories that no structure could erase. A Polish nurse who had survived Auschwitz wrote years later, "The war never ended for us. It only changed its shape." And she was right. The lines between victors and victims blurred in the aftermath. Nations counted their dead. Families lived with silence where laughter used to be. By the end of the decade, the alliances forged in war began to fracture. The world divided once again, East against West, freedom against fear. A new kind of war began, fought not with tanks but with ideology, secrets and shadows. The Cold War was born from the ashes of victory. For those who had lived through it, the end of World War II was not triumph. It was relief. Relief that the noise had stopped, that the skies were clear, that the world, somehow, had survived. But beneath that silence, every survivor carried the same unspoken truth. Nothing would ever be the same again.